the rise of AI may ultimately do something rather unexpected. It may not diminish the humanities. It may usher in a renaissance or revenge of the humanities. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to At The Vanguard. I'd like to begin today with a phrase I heard from Sam Harris. He's mentioned it a few times recently, and when I first heard it, it immediately lodged itself in my mind. The phrase is, the revenge of the humanities. It's one of those ideas that feels self-explanatory the moment you hear it, and yet the more I've thought about it, the more profound it has become. So today I'd like to explore that idea. This episode isn't strictly about artificial intelligence. AI is certainly part of the story, but it's not the story I'm interested in telling. Nor is this an attempt to predict the future. I don't know exactly what AI will mean for the economy, for employment, for civilization at large. What I want to do instead is explore a possibility, one that I find both plausible and hopeful. The possibility is this. As artificial intelligence becomes increasingly capable, perhaps surpassing us in more and more of the tasks that we traditionally have valued, our attention may begin to shift toward the things we value not because they are efficient, but because they are deeply human. And that brings us to the humanities. Before we go any further, it's worth defining what I mean by that term, because different people use it differently. Strictly speaking, the humanities are the disciplines devoted to understanding human culture and the human experience. So, history, philosophy, literature, languages, ethics, the arts. For today's conversation, though, I'm using the term in a slightly broader sense. I'm talking about all the ways human beings explore, express, and make sense of what it means to be alive. Music, theater, dance, film, painting, poetry, storytelling, architecture, and even many of the deeply human dimensions of science, medicine, entrepreneurship, and engineering. In other words, I'm talking about the things that remind us who we are. Over the past century or so, we've gradually come to measure human value by a fairly narrow standard. We celebrate productivity, efficiency, optimization, scale. We ask how quickly can something be done? How cheaply can it be produced? How many people can it reach? And those are all great questions, but they aren't the only questions. Because some of the most important things human beings do aren't about efficiency. No one listens to a symphony because it's the fastest way to spend 40 minutes. No one falls in love because it's productive. No one writes a poem because it's the optimal solution to a problem. The value lies somewhere else. And I suspect we are approaching a moment in history where that distinction is going to matter more than ever. So, today I'd like to unpack this idea that Sam has planted in my brain and make the case that the rise of AI may ultimately do something rather unexpected. It may not diminish the humanities. It may usher in a renaissance or revenge of the humanities. Before we can dive into the humanities, we do have to spend a few minutes talking about artificial intelligence. Over the past several years, we've watched AI progress at a pace that few people anticipated. Systems that once struggled to produce a coherent paragraph are now writing software, generating images, composing music, assisting with scientific research, translating languages, tutoring students, diagnosing disease, and carrying on conversations that at times feel remarkably human. Whether that progress continues at its current pace, or accelerates, or eventually plateaus, I don't know. Predictions about technology have a habit of making fools of us. But one trend is difficult to ignore. Increasingly, the things we once considered uniquely human are becoming things that machines can do, sometimes adequately and sometimes extraordinarily well. Now, it is worth distinguishing between doing a task and experiencing it. We'll come back to that distinction later. For now, I'm simply talking about capability. If a machine can perform a task faster, cheaper, more accurately, and more consistently, then history suggests we will increasingly ask the machine to do it. We've seen this story before. We no longer ask people to perform arithmetic that calculators can perform instantly. We don't insist on navigating with paper maps when GPS can guide us more accurately. We don't plow fields by hand if a tractor can do the work in a fraction of the time. So technology has always shifted the nature of human labor. AI appears poised to continue that trend, but on a much broader scale. And that naturally leads to a question that is becoming more and more pressing. What jobs will humans still have? People are understandably concerned about employment, economic security, and the future of work. Those conversations do matter, but they're incomplete because they assume that work is the primary lens through which we should understand ourselves. There's another question that may ultimately be more important. Not necessarily what will humans do for work, but what will humans choose to do when they no longer have to spend as much or any of their lives working? For most of human history, survival has demanded an extraordinary amount of our time and energy. We worked because we had to. We cultivated food because we had to. We repaired our homes because we had to. We completed countless repetitive, exhausting, and often dangerous tasks simply because there was no alternative. Suppose that changes. Maybe not overnight, and maybe not completely, but maybe substantially. Suppose AI and robotics and automation more broadly continue reducing the amount of human labor required to keep society functioning. If that happens, then we'll arrive at a fascinating moment in history, because, perhaps for the first time on a large scale, many more people may have the opportunity to ask a different kind of question. What do I actually want to do? When people talk about AI, the conversation often gravitates toward employment. Which jobs will disappear? Which jobs are safe? What careers should young people pursue? How should we prepare students? And those are important questions. I'm certainly not dismissing them. Livelihood matters. Economic security matters. Society has some very difficult choices ahead. But they're not the deepest questions. They all imply that the primary purpose of a human life is to work. And that implication is deeply ingrained. We rarely stop to examine it. When we meet someone for the first time, one of the first questions we ask is, "So what do you do?" We generally don't ask, "What brings you alive?" Or, "What do you love?" Or, "What kind of person are you trying to become?" We ask what they do. And of course, that's understandable. Our work occupies an enormous portion of our lives. It shapes our routines, our relationships, our identities. But we have allowed work to become something more than a means of sustaining life. In many cases, it's become the lens through which we measure a life's worth. So when AI enters the picture, our first instinct is to ask, what happens if AI takes my job? But maybe the more interesting question is, what happens if AI gives me back my time? Those are radically different ways of framing the future. One begins with fear, the other begins with possibility. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that technological unemployment will be painless or that everyone is about to inherit an idyllic life of leisure. History suggests transitions like this can be extraordinarily disruptive. Some people may benefit enormously while others struggle. And I don't want to minimize any of that. I'm simply asking us to entertain a possibility. Suppose we reach a point where more and more of the work required to sustain civilization can be performed by machines. What then becomes of us? Not economically, existentially. What do human beings choose to do when they have greater freedom to choose? That question fascinates me because I think it gets at something more impactful than labor markets. It gets at the nature of human flourishing. For centuries, necessity has dictated much of our behavior. We work because we must. We complete obligations because they are unavoidable. We spend enormous amounts of time doing things that are useful, but not necessarily meaningful. If those constraints begin to loosen, even incrementally, I don't think the most interesting story is what disappears. I think it's what emerges. If AI does give us back more of our lives, the question becomes, what will we do with them? One answer is that we'll simply consume more. Movies, music, games, social media, personalized entertainment generated precisely for our tastes. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. I love watching great films. I love reading books. I love listening to music. Art is meant to be experienced. Consumption is not the villain of this story, but it's also not the end of the story. Because there comes a point where consumption alone begins to feel empty. Many of us have experienced this. We spend an entire weekend watching television, scrolling social media, or disappearing into a video game, only to arrive at Sunday evening with the feeling that despite having been constantly entertained, we haven't really been nourished. We've filled our attention, but not our lives. Why? Well, I suspect it's because there's something fundamentally different between receiving an experience and creating one, between observing beauty and contributing to it, between listening to music and making music, between reading a story and writing one. Creation requires something that consumption doesn't. It requires agency. It requires us to leave some imprint of ourselves on the world, however small. That imprint doesn't have to be profound. It doesn't have to be public. It doesn't have to be commercially successful. You don't have to write the next great American novel or paint something worthy of a museum or compose a symphony. Suppose it's enough to prepare a beautiful meal for someone you love, to plant a garden, to teach a child, to write in a journal, to learn a song on the piano, to build a bookshelf, to tell a story around a dinner table. These are all acts of creation. They all carry the same implicit declaration. Something exists now because I chose to bring it into the world. That is deeply human. One of our most fundamental needs isn't merely happiness, but agency. Not simply pleasure, participation. Because meaning isn't something we passively absorb, it's something we actively construct. Now, I realize this is, at least in part, an empirical question. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, given unlimited freedom, most people really would choose an endless stream of personalized entertainment and find themselves perfectly fulfilled. I doubt it, though. Not because I think people are secretly frustrated novelists or painters, but because I think human beings want to participate in their own existence. We don't merely want to witness life, we want to shape it, even in small ways, perhaps especially in small ways. And if that's true, then a future in which necessity occupies less of our time doesn't simply create more consumers, it creates more opportunities for creators. At this point, someone might object. If AI eventually writes a novel that's just as moving as one written by a human being, why should I care who or what wrote it? It's a good question. And I don't think the answer is as simple as saying that human beings will always make better art. They may not. In fact, there may come a day when AI can consistently compose music, write novels, generate films, create paintings that many people genuinely prefer over those made by humans. And if that happens, I don't think the humanities disappear. Because our experience of art has never been limited to the art itself. It's also shaped by the story we tell ourselves about the art. Imagine you walk into a bakery. On the counter are two loaves of bread. They are identical. Same ingredients, same taste, same texture, same price, except one was baked entirely by a machine, the other by a human. Which do you choose? Obviously, real life is messier than that. Usually there are differences in price, quality, convenience, availability, and those things matter. But imagine, just for the sake of argument, that every variable has been held constant except one, the creator. I suspect most of us would reach for the loaf made by another person. Not because it tastes better or because it's objectively superior. The two loaves are identical in every way. But because the fact that another human being made it means something to us. That human story becomes part of the experience. I think this happens throughout the arts. Suppose you read a poem that leaves you speechless. You underline lines, you recommend it to friends, you carry it with you for years. And then someone tells you it was written entirely by AI. Would that information change your experience? The words haven't changed, the poem hasn't changed. And yet, for many of us, something shifts. Not necessarily because we feel deceived, but because the story surrounding the work has changed. We now understand it differently, and that matters. Now, in my last episode, I argued that we should strive to separate the art from the artist. Some people might hear this episode and think I'm contradicting myself. I don't think I am, because for me, those are two different questions. The first asks whether the moral character of an artist should determine the artistic value of their work. I don't think it should. This episode asks something different. It asks whether the humanity of the creator contributes something meaningful to our experience of the work. I think it does. Not because human beings are morally superior or because AI is incapable of producing beauty, but because human beings bring something to art that extends beyond the finished product. They bring a life, a history, a struggle, a perspective, a consciousness. The work becomes evidence that another person was here, that another mind looked out at the universe, felt something, and left behind an attempt to communicate it. It reminds me of something else I think about a lot. Where does the work of art actually end? Is it confined to the canvas, or does it include the frame, the gallery, the lighting, the artist's biography, the historical moment in which it was created? If you put the Mona Lisa in a neon pink frame, would that affect your experience? Of course it would. The painting hasn't changed, and yet your relationship to it has. Art doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's experienced in context. And perhaps one of the most powerful contexts we can ever know is that another human being made this. So, why call this the revenge of the humanities? It's a provocative phrase, perhaps a little hyperbolic. I don't imagine the heads of every major university humanities department standing triumphantly over the smoking ruins of Silicon Valley. This isn't revenge against science or technology or AI. In fact, I hope AI continues to advance. I hope it helps us cure disease, accelerate scientific discovery, eliminate drudgery, expand education, and improve billions of lives. This isn't a story about AI losing, it's a story about humanity winning. The revenge is directed at something else. It's directed at a way of thinking. For generations, we've increasingly measured value through the lens of productivity. How fast can it be done? How much can it produce? How efficiently can it scale? How much economic value does it create? And these aren't bad questions, they're often essential, but they are incomplete. Because some of the most meaningful experiences in life simply refuse to be evaluated that way. No one asks how efficiently they fell in love. No one asks whether friendship has a good return on investment. No one measures the success of a sunset by how productive it was. Some things matter for reasons that transcend utility. The humanities have always reminded us of that. And yet, culturally, they've often been treated as luxuries. We praise STEM while apologizing for the arts. We cut music programs when budgets get tight. We tell young people to pursue what's practical and then wonder why so many feel disconnected from purpose. We consume extraordinary amounts of art while simultaneously treating the people who create it as though they've chosen an indulgent career. That's a strange contradiction. Our lives are saturated with music, films, stories, design, architecture, theater, literature, philosophy. These aren't peripheral to civilization, they are civilization. The revenge of the humanities isn't that they suddenly become important, they've always been important. The revenge is that in an age when machines increasingly outperform us at the tasks we've historically prized for their utility, we're forced to confront the question, if our value doesn't lie primarily in our productivity, where does it lie? I think the humanities have been answering that question all along, not because they're opposed to science or technology, but because they ask different questions. Science asks, what is true? Engineering asks, what can we build? Medicine asks, how can we alleviate suffering? The humanities ask, what is worth building? What kind of people should we become? How should we live? Those questions don't become less important in the age of AI. If anything, they become more urgent. Because as our capabilities expand, our wisdom has to expand with them. Technology gives us power. The humanities help us decide what that power is for. And perhaps that's the real revenge. Not that the humanities finally defeat science, but that they remind us that science was never the whole story. One objection I can imagine is this: Christopher, you're putting the humanities on a pedestal. Aren't medicine, engineering, mathematics, physics, entrepreneurship, and countless other fields just as important? Absolutely. This isn't an argument for replacing one hierarchy with another. It's not an argument against science or engineering or business. I admire all those pursuits immensely. My point is this: every one of those disciplines ultimately points back to human beings. Why do we practice medicine? To alleviate human suffering. Why do we engineer bridges? To help people connect, travel, and flourish. Why do we pursue scientific discovery? Not simply because knowledge is valuable in itself, although I believe it is, but because understanding reality enriches human life. It expands our horizons. It changes how we see ourselves and our place in the universe. Why do we build businesses? To solve human problems, to improve human lives, to create opportunities for people. Even our most technical pursuits ultimately derive their significance from the fact that they matter to conscious creatures. They matter because they matter to us. That's why I don't see the humanities as competing with these fields. I see them as providing their context. Science helps us understand the universe. The humanities help us understand the beings trying to understand the universe. Science tells us what we can do. The humanities help us wrestle with what we ought to do. Science extends our reach. The humanities shape the hands doing the reaching. That's why they permeate so much of human life. Medicine isn't only science, it's compassion. Teaching isn't only the transfer of information, it's mentorship. Architecture isn't only engineering, it's beauty. Leadership isn't only management, it's ethics. Even mathematics can inspire wonder, and entrepreneurship rests on philosophy, whether we recognize it or not. The humanities aren't confined to one building on a university campus. They appear anywhere human beings ask questions about meaning, purpose, beauty, justice, identity, love, suffering, or what makes a life well lived. They are woven into civilization itself. All roads lead back to humans. And therefore, all roads eventually intersect with the humanities. Because the humanities, at their core, are our ongoing attempt to understand ourselves, to understand what it means to be this peculiar species, capable of reason and imagination, of cruelty and compassion, of creating cathedrals and concentration camps, of writing symphonies while simultaneously inventing nuclear weapons. We are a profoundly strange creature, perhaps the strangest we know. The humanities are our conversation with ourselves about what we're becoming. And that is a conversation we will never outgrow. If anything I've said resonates with you, then the obvious question becomes, what do we do with it? And the good news is that I don't think this requires some sudden, sweeping cultural revolution. It begins with much smaller shifts. The first, and perhaps the most important, is simply to reconsider how we think about the humanities, not as luxuries or electives, not as the things we do after the important work is finished, but as essential parts of a flourishing human life. Take notice how casually we sometimes dismiss the arts, as though these things merely fill the spaces between the meaningful parts of life. I don't believe that's true. Stories shape our values. Music gives voice to emotions that often resist language. Theater invites us to inhabit lives other than our own. Literature expands our empathy. Philosophy teaches us to think more carefully. History gives us perspective. The humanities don't distract us from life, they deepen our experience of it. The second thing we can do is support the people who devote their lives to these pursuits. Attend a play. Buy the book instead of pirating it. Go to the concert. Visit the museum. Take the dance class. Commission the artist. Donate to an arts organization. Recommend a podcast. Share someone's work. None of us can support everything, but all of us are always supporting something. Whether we realize it or not, we are constantly casting votes with our attention, our time, our money, and our enthusiasm. Those choices shape culture. They tell the market and one another what we value. Third, become a student again. Read philosophy, even if it's only a few pages each week. Listen to music you don't yet understand. Visit an art museum. Read a novel that challenges you. Watch a classic film. Take a workshop. Learn an instrument. You don't need to pursue a degree or change your career. Curiosity is enough. And finally, create. Not because you're trying to become famous or monetize a hobby. Not every creative act needs to become a side hustle. Create because it's one of the ways human beings participate in life. Write the poem, plant the garden, cook the meal, sing in the choir, paint terribly, dance awkwardly, build the bookshelf. Tell your family's stories before they're forgotten. Most of these things will never be seen by more than a handful of people. Some won't be seen by anyone else at all. That doesn't diminish their value. The humanities aren't only what we consume, they're what we practice. They're how we make sense of ourselves. They're how we connect with one another. And they're how we leave behind a small piece of ourselves for those who come after. I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Imagine that thousands of years from now, humanity is gone. Perhaps we destroy ourselves. Perhaps we leave Earth. Perhaps we simply evolve into something unrecognizable. Whatever the reason, imagine another intelligent civilization eventually arrives here. They begin excavating what's left behind. They discover our roads, our bridges, our factories and computers, our satellites, our equations. They would undoubtedly learn a tremendous amount about what we were capable of. But would they know us? Would they know what it felt like to fall in love, to lose a parent, to fear death, to hold a newborn child, to hope, to despair, to laugh until you couldn't breathe, to wonder why we're here in the first place? It's not from our machines or our infrastructure, not from our balance sheets or our self-driving cars. They would find us somewhere else. They would find us in Shakespeare, in Beethoven, in Toni Morrison, in Van Gogh, in Martha Graham, in our films, our poetry, our architecture, our journals, our letters, our songs, our myths, our philosophy. They would discover humanity through the traces we left of our inner lives. And that's what the humanities ultimately are. They're humanity's conversation with itself, across generations, across cultures, across centuries. They are the externalization of consciousness, the record of what it was like to be us. And that's why I am optimistic. I don't think AI will save the humanities, and I don't think everyone is suddenly going to become artists, philosophers, and historians. But I do think that as machines increasingly assume responsibility for the tasks where efficiency matters most, we'll be invited to spend a little more of our lives asking questions that machines can't answer for us. Questions like, who am I? What do I love? What is beautiful? What is worth creating? What kind of person do I want to become? Those aren't engineering or economic questions. They're human questions. And they'll remain human questions for as long as there are humans to ask them. That's the revenge of the humanities. Not that they'll finally triumph over science or replace technology, but that they remind us of something we risk overlooking whenever we become too enamored with productivity, optimization, and efficiency. That civilization has never been measured solely by what it can produce, but also by what it chooses to cherish. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay curious.